Mr. Falkvinge, welcome to Berlin Adlershof. I appreciate you being here. Let me just say a few words for people that may not know who you are. You are the founder of the Pirate Party in '06. You've been named IT Person of the Year. You have been named Top 100 Global Thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine, Most Influential People by Time magazine. So I would say you're kind of a big deal. You know? I'm sure you'd agree.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about cryptocurrency in general and Bitcoin specifically, since it is probably the best known cryptocurrency. And Bitcoin has been making quite an impact. I believe it hit the $7,500 benchmark, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, 1.5 weeks ago, something like that. It's dropped since then, but not too much, you know. People are still going crazy about it. However, people are going crazy to invest in Bitcoin rather than spend it like you would with any other currency. So my question is could Bitcoin even be considered a real currency, or is it just a fad to get people interested?
I think this is an excellent question. You know, Bitcoin started out as a currency. It started out as a peer-to-peer payment system, peer-to-peer cash, peer-to-peer electronic cash, to replace central bank money for all intents and purposes. When I'm demonstrating Bitcoin to somebody, I usually take out my phone. I have a few coins on here. I ask people to take out their phone, and I make a transfer as they see it. And once they realize they actually received money, and that the fact that these two phones were next to each other is a pure coincidence. The other phone might as well have been in Malaysia, and it could have been a Sunday. And no financial block lists or authorities were involved in reviewing this transfer, and it was instant. You feel like you've jumped 40 years into the future. I mean, you literally have to try to believe it. And this is how it started out. After that, it has gotten into a bit of an investment frenzy, and I think that's misguided. There's also a bit of internal struggle between different Bitcoin factions right now. One is focusing on the use case of Bitcoin as gold, as they call it, as in you're storing value digitally. The other team, which I would subscribe to, is sticking to the original plan that Bitcoin is first and foremost a very, very convenient payment system.
Which would be Bitcoin Cash.
Which would be Bitcoin Cash, exactly.
So you actually support the idea of using it as a currency and not as an asset, basically.
Well, it needs to be both. As in, if you use it to exchange value, it must also be able to store value. But those things go hand in hand, as in you can't use it as a store of value unless there is a consistent demand for it to be used as exchange, because the value, the price of any commodity is dependent on supply and demand. And so unless you have a consistent demand for something, you can't store value in it. So it really needs to go both ways, in my opinion.
It's really hard for people to even consider Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency, but we'll focus on Bitcoin, to replace a national currency.
Isn't it?
It really is. How is the sovereign, national banks, in the end the government, supposed to just give up their power?
Oh, they won't. And let me give you a couple of perspectives on this. The central banks right now are printing money for all the machinery can take in order to print their way out of debt. This is happening in the United States, this is happening in the European Union, and once this cycle starts, once governments start printing money to pay their own debt, the story doesn't have a happy ending. And so Bitcoin was devised to replace or at least challenge this system of money. But remember, we've rethought what money is a number of times. Our current monetary system isn't old. It was invented on August 15, 1971, when the United States declared bankruptcy. Of course, it wasn't worded like that. And since then, we're basically living in a huge monetary experiment where central banks are printing as much money as they can to see what happens. And that story usually doesn't have a happy ending. In contrast, Bitcoin is what would be called sound money. It can be trusted because there is nobody that can suddenly inflate the entire money supply. It is predictable, it is agreed on. In that way, it's kind of like a language. With the central bank money, you can have police point a gun at somebody and say, give us the taxes you owe us, which comes back to governments. With cryptocurrency, It's like a language. Nobody can point a gun at anybody and have a language changed. In that way, in the same way, nobody can point a gun at a computer and say, transfer this money out of there. Governments have depended on being able to seize money from central banks as their last line of defense for taxation. With cryptocurrency gaining ground, once governments realize just how big this is, it's going to be too late for them. And we're in for such enormous changes, not just in terms of how governments are run. You're also seeing a wealth transfer that is the biggest since Rockefeller. Rockefeller had 3 rules for getting rich. Get up early, work hard, find oil. In other words, you need to be lucky. We're seeing the same kind of wealth transfer to the geeks and nerds and weird computer guys right now as part of cryptocurrency. And I think the really profound changes are not going to come from the challenge to government. The really profound changes is that since 1850, it's been the oil industry that has been dictating what money goes into research, because they have been the one sitting on the money.
Oh, and now the nerds, as you say it, are dictating where the money goes, since they have it.
Exactly. How would the world look, what would the world look like if the geeks and nerds and libertarians were sitting on all the money determining what gets researched or not? It's certainly not going to be a better diesel engine.
So, as I understand it, it is, rather than just looking at the Bitcoin, it's the blockchain technology that is really revolutionary, right? Is that a correct assumption to make?
They are very connected, as in Bitcoin is the first example of the blockchain technology. You can see a lot of banks talking about using blockchain for their next currency. That's completely missing the point, because using a blockchain means giving up control. You are trusting an algorithm, you're trusting mathematics to issue money instead of a human decision, which can be corrupted, which can be bought, which can serve different interests.
You were saying that this would basically make banks obsolete, I think 3 years ago.
Absolutely. The Bitcoin or cryptocurrency will do the same thing to banks as email did to the postal industry.
While we still have the postal industry, just much smaller.
They're delivering from Amazon. They're no longer delivering letters to and from you and I. And so we no longer need a bank. We no longer need to ask permission from a bank to transfer money between each other. That is enormous. The implications of that are profound.
But they're not going to give up without a fight.
Once they realize what the fight is about, it's going to be too late.
Because they want to start, using the blockchain technology. I mean, if I'm quoting the Deutsche Bank London, they're saying it has great potential, and even the Virgin founder Richard Branson has held a blockchain summit.
Yeah.
I mean, they are interested.
They are, the Richard Branson's infamous blockchain summit on his island, yeah. It's fun seeing photos from there every year. But yeah, they are aware of the blockchain technology. They just haven't realized yet that this is an extinction-level event for today's financial institutions. But
not just for banks. You're also saying that the blockchain could be used or even revolutionize like government services, right? So if you have like land registry or I don't know, buying property,
absolutely.
Could it replace it completely? I just can't understand, or I can't really fathom that somebody would even officially recognize this transaction. I mean, who's going to be the sovereign?
That's the thing. This takes violence out of the equation, because once everybody agrees that the balances in the blockchain are the ones we agree are valid, then violence can no longer be used to change those balances. And when I'm talking violence here, I'm not talking about a mugger in an alley. I'm talking about a Supreme Court deciding in a civil lawsuit. I'm talking about a squadron of tanks rolling into a land that, for the first time in history, does not change the ownership of that land.
So is it because, I mean, this sounds like anarchist idealism?
There are absolutely anarchists who love this, because it promotes something called the non-aggression principle, meaning that even if you try aggression, it's no longer going to change who owns what.
Because it's in the blockchain?
Because it's in the blockchain.
You know, it's difficult for me to understand now, because right now, if you buy property, if you register land, you go to, I don't know, some sort of government entity, right?
Exactly.
And they give you a piece of paper and it's stamped and it's official. So now if I do this via the blockchain, let's say I would do this now, I don't have a stamp from the government.
You don't.
So the government will tell me, no, this is not your property.
Exactly. So land is not on the blockchain yet, but let me illustrate something here. This is my Bitcoin Cash wallet. I can see I have a couple of coins in it. There is a list of transactions here. You can observe that no government approved these transactions. I was the sole arbiter, the final decider which transactions go out. Other people will be the final arbiter of what transactions go in. Today, a government decides who owns what land. But we're already seeing that assets can be taken out of the control of government, because I decide what money goes in and out of these wallets. A judge ruling that the money should go out of this phone or out of my storage, my bigger storage, has absolutely no effect on that storage. And those changes are going to be profound, because at the end of the day, what this means is that the government can no longer collect taxes from people who are not voluntarily willing to pay them.
That sounds great, especially when you pay taxes in Germany. It does, doesn't it? Could you give me a timeline?
Times are really hard to predict. They say that in general, you always overestimate what's going to happen in 1 year, and you always underestimate what's going to happen in 10 years. We see now that there's quite a bit of, well, there's no need to mince words. There's quite a bit of infighting about Bitcoin. What is it going to be? What is its ultimate vision? But one thing that all these people who fight on the future of Bitcoin agree on is that the free market should be the ultimate decider of this. So there might be room for two different types of Bitcoin, Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash, where Bitcoin Core is a store of value. All cryptocurrencies store well in excess of $100 billion. Today, I think it's close to $180 billion. Or Bitcoin Cash, which is for easy, almost free, unstoppable, even unseeable transactions.
And you mentioned there's a little bit of beef, between the parties. This would mean that there's people involved, and with people come problems.
Exactly. So this is a great technological innovation, but it is not immune to social problems. And so we are going to see power struggles within the community, from the outside of the community, from new people who want to be part of the community.
Such as governments, banks?
Banks, governments, financial institutions who
want
a piece of the pie.
Are you not afraid they're going to snatch away the technology and just use it for themselves? I mean,
they've been trying, but the whole point of banks are dependent on printing money. When you're starting to go into Bitcoin, one of the first questions you ask yourself is, so where does a Bitcoin come from? And the answer to that question, by the way, is that the person who finds that little signature at the end of every ledger page, every block, gets a little bit of reward for that. That's how money gets into the system. But if this seems odd to you, start looking at where a euro comes from, where a US dollar comes from. Today, money comes from banks literally conjuring money out of thin air when somebody takes a mortgage on their house, and the banks get to lend that invented money out at interest.
Multiple times.
Multiple times. That's where a euro comes from. That's from where a dollar comes from. If people understood the sheer audacity and corruptness of this system, there would be riots. In this way, I would much rather have people get a little bit of reward for keeping the system safe and secure.
So which currency is going to be the future? I know there's over 900.
Wow.
Bitcoin,
Yeah.
Bitcoin Cash, something completely different?
You know, it is really hard to predict. 10 years ago, nobody could possibly think of any scenario which would dethrone Nokia from the throne of mobile phones.
So it's impossible to predict?
It is impossible to predict. What we can say with certainty is that economics dictates with certainty that something has value because of two reasons. It is useful and it is scarce, meaning that it's not infinite in amount. That's the two things that give everything value. Gold, silver, copper, chairs, furniture, and Bitcoin. Bitcoin is useful because you can transfer value with it. So, but what's going to be the winning cryptocurrency in the end? The most useful one. Today, Bitcoin, I would argue that Bitcoin Core is not very useful. It's useful in the sense that it rises in value, so it makes people multimillionaires on an assembly line. But that is not enough long term. To sustain usefulness long term, you have to actually use it. And in that aspect, I would argue that Bitcoin Cash, which is aiming for sub-cent optional transaction fees and having instant reliable transactions across the planet with nobody able to censor or prevent them, has more usability. There are other cryptocurrencies that have even more usability, but then you have the network effect. A network, the value of a network is proportional to the square of the people using it. Bitcoin might be taken over by something better in the future.
Or it may be replaced?
Yes, but by a different cryptocurrency. What I can say with absolute certainty is that we change monetary systems completely about every 60 to 40 years. The current monetary system dates back to August 15, 1971. People think it's 500 years old because that's when fractional banking was invented. It's not. It only dates back to the so-called Nixon shock. And so what's going to come next? I don't know. But cryptocurrency has a very, very good shot at it.
So do you still pay cash?
I do. I like cash. I use credit cards, but I like cash because it's untraceable. And in this way, Bitcoin actually has grave, grave concerns. You'll remember me saying that a Bitcoin comes into the system, or to be more precise, 12.5 Bitcoins comes into the system when somebody finds this little signature confirming a page in the ledger of accounting. That means that every single unit of Bitcoin and fractional unit of a Bitcoin is traceable throughout its entire history of existence. You might not know who owns the account. For all intents and purposes, Bitcoin accounts are like Swiss number accounts. You don't know who owns them unless they come forward and identifies. But law enforcement loves this.
They could still find out, right?
Cash it can be traced. I mean, if you're using a credit card at one point to buy Bitcoin, then you have an identity at this point in time, and you can sort of start to unravel connections in the transaction history. Law enforcement loves this because there has never been a more traceable type of money. And so there are other types of cryptocurrency like Dash, like Monero, like Zcash, that specialize in privacy, where you essentially have a huge laundry machine, money laundering machine, let's call it for what it is, that launders all the money in the world every 10 or 15 minutes so that nothing is traceable ever. And this has its uses. I'm sometimes at conferences where people are standing up and saying that Bitcoin is only used for drugs and weapons trade and illegal things.
It's what you hear of.
And what?
It's what you hear of.
It was you hear, right? And usually the people saying this are bankers. So I'm saying that, you're right, that Bitcoin is being used for drugs and guns, unlike the US dollar, which you apparently prefer. At which point the entire audience bursts out laughing and the discussion is kind of over. But they have a point, right? As in, Bitcoin is just better money because you can use it for more things. It is better money because you can use it in more ways.
Not yet, though. You can't spend a Bitcoin everywhere. You can't go to the Asian restaurant around the corner and pay with Bitcoin.
True,
not yet.
True, but there are regulations preventing you from using euros in certain ways that you can use Bitcoin for. And so it is very appealing to libertarians. It is very appealing to people who talk about sound money, money where the government doesn't get to say how you can spend it.
So is Bitcoin bad for the environment? I believe you've probably read the headline. I'm going to read one, I think it was from Vice magazine. One Bitcoin transaction now uses as much energy as your house in a week.
It is a stunning comparison, isn't it? But you also need to remember that the entire Bitcoin network is using as much energy as one branch of the Bank of America. It's funny how this argument is coming out of the old world. Because there was a comic circulating maybe 5 years ago, and it's still very, very spot on. It's about a person coming to their bank advisor and saying, I'm thinking of investing some in Bitcoin. What do you have to say to me? And they're going a little bit angry about this, saying that I would really advise against this. Bitcoin is being run by nefarious forces. It can go up and down without any control. It is completely unregulated. You can lose all your money overnight without much control or oversight. And the person asking for advice goes a little bit concerned, saying that, how is this different from the stock market? And the bank advisor says angrily, when you're using Bitcoin, I don't get to charge you fees.
Mm-hmm. That's basically the point, right?
That is basically the point. And, you know, my friends and family, I've been advising them to invest in Bitcoin since 2011.
They should have listened to you, did they?
Well, I went all in Bitcoin in 2011. I took my entire savings and my entire credit line
and bought in at about
$3.
Are you a millionaire now?
Multi-millionaire, of course. But that might not be very honest, but I mean, it's...
But I mean, if you know where Bitcoin was and where it is now...
Yeah, I mean, it was at $3 when I went all in, and it's at about 7,000, 8,000, all folks combined now. So it is only logical.
Kudos to you, I would say.
Thank you. But it's a little bit hard for people to take in that the advice I gave in that year, Bitcoin has been the best performing asset across all classes in 2011, 2012, 2013, not 2014, I missed that year, 2015, 2016, and it looks like 2017 again. That means there was no advisor on the planet for 6 out of 7 years that could have given better investment advice. And so when people go to their bank managers, and I'm pointing this out, they don't really have tools to deal with this observation.
What advice would you give people today?
I can't give financial advice because it gives me liability. So if anything I've said here can be construed as financial advice, then it wasn't. But Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is a bit of a crossroads. Cryptocurrency will be the future. There's nobody doubting that. As to which cryptocurrency will be the future, that's hard to predict. But I would look at utility. I would look at what people are showing each other off as cool. And today that is Bitcoin Cash. It could be some other cryptocurrency taking the lead. But today I would look at Bitcoin Cash, I would look at Ethereum, I would look at Monero, I would look at Zcash, and I would look at Dash, those 5 currencies. But I can't give investment advice. I can say that they are really cool, and I think they will have at least one of these 5 will have a really big part in our financial future as central bank currencies will find themselves increasingly displaced.
And we'll put a big disclaimer, you know, a verbal disclaimer that you're not allowed to give financial advice, but I appreciate that.
Big blinking thing. This is not financial advice when I say this is financial advice.
We can do that. Let me just summarize. So you definitely see cryptocurrency as the future.
Not just cryptocurrency. Blockchain has the ledger for any asset. Currency just happens to be the first application of it.
So you're saying like for government services perhaps, so we would
Land registry would be a very logical thing.
So leaner government, maybe zero government?
We would see a government struggling for survival as it realizes it no longer has a means to collect taxes. You know, if I'm abstracting a bit, our economy basically looks like this. You have the bottom layer of people doing all the work. You have an abstraction of people doing all the work called corporations on top of the people doing the work. You have another layer called banks who siphon off money off of corporations. And at the top you have governments. And governments are essentially taking money from the work of the bottom layer with the help of corporations and banks. This is how governments are feeding themselves. When Bitcoin does to banks what email did to the postal service and renders banks largely irrelevant, because Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer currency. I don't need a bank to give you money. Then governments can no longer rely on today's systems to feed themselves. That's going to be a shock. And bureaucrats are going to say, but this can't be. We must have this. We must have this. We must regulate. And somebody's going to point out that, you know, the problem is that this cannot be regulated in the first place. And bureaucrats are going to be, then we must regulate it. But it cannot be regulated. It would be trying to regulate gravity. They are in for a world they don't have tools to manage. And I, for one, are going to bring out a very, very big bowl of popcorn to look at that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.